If you're new, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. It only takes a second, but it gives us motivation to create more stories. So please like this video, and now let's start the story. I never thought my life would take the turn it did. Looking back, I still wonder how things spiraled the way they did. I was a regular wife, living what I thought was a normal, stable life with my husband, David. We had been married for 7 years, and while things weren't perfect, I never imagined I would be telling this story one day. David worked for a large corporate firm, a job he was passionate about, but also one that took up most of his time. He was always trying to prove himself, always pushing for the next big promotion. I admired that about him, his ambition and drive. But somewhere along the way, his job became the priority. And our marriage? Well, it just became another thing on his to-do list. I was a freelance graphic designer, working from home, which gave me a lot of time to myself. First, it was nice. I enjoyed the quiet, the ability to make my own schedule. But over time, it got lonely. I missed having real conversations, meaningful connections. David and I barely talked anymore. When we did, it was about bills, his work, or what we needed from the grocery store. The spark we once had? Gone. And then I met Michael. Michael was David's boss. I had heard his name before, in passing. David talked about him with a mix of admiration and frustration. He was the kind of boss who pushed his employees hard, expected perfection, but also rewarded those who performed well. He was a name in the industry, someone people respected and, honestly, feared. The first time I met him in person was at a company event. David had finally been promoted, and there was a celebration dinner at a high-end restaurant downtown. I wasn't even sure I wanted to go. Our marriage was at a point where I felt more like his roommate than his wife. But I put on a dress, did my hair, and played the part of the supportive spouse. When we arrived, the restaurant was buzzing with people. David introduced me to his colleagues, shaking hands, making small talk. And then he introduced me to Michael. Michael was older than David, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of confidence that instantly filled a room. He had sharp blue eyes, a strong presence. When he shook my hand, he held my gaze just long enough to make me feel noticed. "It's nice to finally meet the woman behind the man," he said with a smile. I laughed politely, making some comment about how David talked about work so much. I felt like I knew Michael already. The conversation moved quickly, and soon, Michael was pulled away by other executives. But for the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. After that night, I didn't think much about Michael, not at first. But then, a few weeks later, David asked me to join him for another company dinner. He was hesitant about it, saying it was just a casual gathering. But I knew what he really meant. He didn't want to go alone, but he also wasn't thrilled about me coming. I went anyway, and that's when things really started. At the dinner, Michael and I ended up seated near each other. The conversation flowed easily. Unlike David, who barely asked about my work anymore, Michael was genuinely interested. He asked about my design projects, my creative process. He made me feel like my work mattered. It was refreshing. By the end of the night, I realized something unsettling. I was enjoying his company more than I should have. It started small after that. A friendly message on LinkedIn, commenting on one of my projects. A quick email asking if I had recommendations for a graphic designer for his company. Then, an invitation for coffee to discuss business. I told myself it was harmless. After all, David was always too busy to grab coffee with me. What was the harm in a little conversation? But deep down, I knew. I was looking forward to these moments with Michael more than I should. I knew that when my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him. I knew that I was dressing a little differently, paying a little more attention to how I looked, and I knew I was crossing a line. The thing about emotional affairs is that they sneak up on you. They start as innocent conversations, shared laughs, mutual interests. You tell yourself it's nothing, just a friend, just a colleague, just someone who understands you. But then, suddenly, you realize you're keeping secrets. You're checking your phone in the other room. You're deleting messages before your husband can see them. And you wonder, how did I get here? I remember the first time Michael and I met outside of work-related reasons. He had invited me to an art gallery opening. He knew I loved art, knew it was my passion. David, of course, was too busy to go, stuck at the office late again. So I went. I told myself it was just an outing, that it didn't mean anything. But when I arrived, Michael was already there, waiting for me. He smiled when he saw me, a smile that felt different. The night was perfect. He walked beside me, listened as I talked about the pieces, shared his own thoughts. He made me feel seen. And that was the problem, because David hadn't made me feel that way in years. That night, when I got home, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching David as he typed away on his laptop, not even noticing I had come in. I wanted to tell him about the gallery, about the way Michael and I had talked for hours about art, about creativity, about life. But I didn't, because deep down I knew he wouldn't care. And that realization hurt more than anything. That was the night I knew I was in trouble. The night I realized this wasn't just some harmless friendship. This was something else entirely. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. I should have stopped it. I know that now. I should have recognized the danger, the way my feelings were shifting, the way I was starting to crave Michael's presence in a way that wasn't just about friendship. But at the time, I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. After all, nothing had happened. Not really. That's what I kept telling myself. But the thing about emotions is that they don't care about logic. They don't care about lines or boundaries. They creep in quietly, settle into the spaces where something is missing. And before you know it, they take over. I started seeing Michael more often. At first, it was always under some excuse. Work-related, a casual coffee, an art event he knew I'd enjoy. And every time I told myself this wasn't an affair. It was just someone who understood me, someone who listened, someone who cared, someone who wasn't David. David was slipping further away from me, and I didn't even think he noticed. Our conversations were becoming shorter, less meaningful. He was consumed by work, always on his phone, always talking about the next project, the next deal. One night I tried. I really tried. I had made dinner, something I knew he liked. I set the table, put away my phone, and decided that tonight we would talk. We would connect. But when he came home, he barely looked up from his phone. He muttered a distracted, "Hey," before sitting down, scrolling through emails as he ate. I tried to start a conversation, asked about his day, tried to talk about something we could do together over the weekend. His answers were short, dismissive. And then, in the middle of dinner, his phone rang. "Sorry, I have to take this," he said, already getting up. And just like that, he was gone. I sat there, staring at the empty chair across from me, my food untouched. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I picked up my phone, I opened my messages, and I texted Michael. It was just a simple message, nothing inappropriate, just a comment about an art exhibit I had seen online. Something I knew he would appreciate. Within seconds, he replied. And suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I stayed up late, texting Michael. The conversation flowed so easily, like it always did. We talked about art, life, our dreams, our frustrations. He asked about my work, my goals. And before I knew it, I was telling him things I hadn't even admitted to myself. That I felt invisible. That I felt like I was just existing, not living. That I wasn't sure when my marriage had started feeling like a duty instead of a partnership. And he listened. He didn't judge. He just understood. The next day, he invited me to lunch. I hesitated. I knew what this was turning into, but I went anyway. We met at a small restaurant downtown, one of those quiet places with dim lighting and soft music. It felt intimate even though we were just talking. Michael was easy to be around. He made me laugh, made me feel interesting, like what I had to say mattered. And the way he looked at me, it was different. It wasn't like how David looked at me, distracted and distant. It was full of interest, of attention. When lunch was over, he walked me to my car. And then he did something that sent my heart racing. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. It was such a small gesture, so subtle. But it felt like everything. I should have pulled away. I should have said something. But I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just a friendship. This was something else. Something dangerous. something I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that moment, about the way his fingers had brushed against my skin, the way my heart had pounded in my chest. I felt guilty. I did. But I also felt alive. And that scared me more than anything. The next few weeks were a blur. We kept seeing each other, kept finding excuses to talk, to meet. It was always innocent. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Lunches, coffee, long conversations about life and dreams and regrets. But deep down, I knew what was happening. One evening, Michael called me. "Are you free?" he asked. I hesitated. "David's home." There was a silence on the other end. Then a quiet sigh. "I just wanted to see you," he said, and something inside me cracked. Because I wanted to see him too. I knew I was playing with fire. I knew I was risking everything. But I couldn't stop. The night everything fell apart, I knew I had gone too far. For weeks, I had been living in two different worlds. In one, I was David's wife, the woman he barely noticed, the woman who smiled at dinner parties and pretended everything was fine. In the other, I was someone else entirely. Someone who felt seen, who felt important, who felt wanted. Michael and I had never crossed a physical line, but emotionally we had gone past the point of no return. We were constantly in touch, finding moments to see each other, sharing parts of ourselves that we had no business sharing. I kept telling myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, that as long as I didn't act on the feelings, I wasn't really betraying David. But deep down, I knew. And then one evening, David came home early. I'd been sitting on the couch, my phone in my hands, texting Michael. I was so wrapped up in the conversation that I didn't hear the front door open. I didn't see David standing there, watching me. "Who are you talking to?" His voice startled me, and I fumbled to lock my phone. But it was too late. David wasn't stupid. He had seen the way I had changed, the way I smiled at my phone more than I smiled at him, the way I was distracted even when I was sitting right next to him. "Just a friend," I said quickly, but my voice was shaky. "A friend," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "You've been different, you know that? Distant. Always on your phone, always somewhere else." I forced a laugh. "David, you're imagining things." But he wasn't, and I could see it in his eyes, the suspicion, the hurt. That night, he didn't touch his phone. He didn't get lost in emails. He just watched me, as if trying to piece everything together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt guilty. Really guilty. Because David may have been distant, but he was still my husband. And what I was doing, what I was feeling, was wrong. The next day, I met Michael for coffee. I told myself it would be the last time, that I just needed to say goodbye, to put an end to whatever this was before it turned into something worse. But when I saw him, when he smiled at me in that way that made me feel like I was the only person in the world, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. We sat across from each other, in a quiet cafe. And for the first time, I let myself say the words I had been avoiding. "This is wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael studied me for a long moment. "Is it?" I swallowed hard. "I'm married." "I know." His voice was calm. But there was something else there. Something almost sad. "And I can't do this anymore," I continued. "Whatever this is, it has to stop." Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I don't want to lose you." My heart clenched because I didn't want to lose him either, but I had already lost so much of myself in this. "I have to fix my marriage," I said, more to myself than to him. He nodded, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand." And just like that, it was over. At least that's what I thought. But life has a way of making sure you face your mistakes. 2 days later, David confronted me. He had seen the texts. He had gone through my phone. "I trusted you," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought we were just in a rough patch. I thought we could fix it." Tears burned my eyes. "David, don't," he cut me off. "Just tell me the truth. Were you in love with him?" The truth sat heavy in my chest, because I didn't know the answer. Did I love Michael? Or did I just love the way he made me feel? I hesitated too long, and that hesitation was all David needed. He walked away. That was the moment I realized I had broken something I couldn't fix. We tried for a while. Therapy, long conversations, promises to be better, but the damage was done. David never looked at me the same way again. And no matter how much I wanted to pretend things could go back to the way they were, they couldn't. In the end, we separated. Not because of one single mistake, but because of everything that had led us there. Years of neglect, of miscommunication, of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Michael and I never spoke again. Sometimes I wonder if he ever thinks about me, if he ever wonders what could have been. But I don't let myself dwell on it for too long, because at the end of the day, the only thing worse than losing my marriage was realizing that I had lost myself along the way. I didn't want to stop,